Thank you for joining us today, and we are glad that you are taking time out of your day to view this one-hour webinar. My name is Dave Helge, Vice President of Maintenance and Safety for Idealease. Idealease is committed to providing our customers and potential customers with safety and compliance information to assist you in enhancing your safety and loss control program. Due to the pandemic, we have canceled our on-site safety seminars in 2020 to protect the safety and health of our employees and you, our customer. In lieu of the seminars, we will be presenting 6 one-hour webinars over the next 3 months. Today's webinar is the 4th of the series. The topic for today is New Hours of Service Regulation Changes and the ELD. Today we will look at the basic hours of service regulations and changes to the regulations that will go into effect on September 29th. We will also review the electronic logging device, or ELD, regulations. Now enjoy the webinar.
So today we're going to discuss the driver's hours of service regulations. We'll take a look at hours of service rules, hours of service exceptions, time record requirements, and then next Tuesday, there are going to be 4 changes to the hours of service regulations. We're going to take a look at each and every one of those. We'll finish it out with taking a look at the electric logging devices, then finally talk about some best practices for hours of service regulation compliance. So driver's hours of service logs. We're going to take a look at the current regulations today, who's required to comply to those, and then we'll jump into the exceptions after that. So today for interstate, governed by the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, those carriers, for interstate operations, if you operate a vehicle with a gross vehicle weight rating, gross combination weight rating, or gross weight of 10,001 or more pounds, if you're transporting more than 8 passengers, including the driver for compensation, or more than 15 passengers, including the driver not for compensation, or you're transporting hazardous materials in placable quantities, you are required to comply with CFR 395, which is the hours of service regulations. So for intrastate, you're going to have to check. If you're an intrastate carrier, you're going to have to check to see where your state is with adopting the FMCSA regulations. Many of the states have, but I can tell you there's many states out there where the hours of service regulations for intrastate operations do not happen until you've got CDL, 26,001 or more pounds. So if you need that information, I'll have a slide up at the end of this webinar. Just send me an email and I'll be glad to send you your state's intrastate hours of service regulations. So let's take a look at the current hours of service regulations as of today. As I indicated, we're going to have 4 of these regulations change next Tuesday. And as we go through here, we'll tell you which ones of those will change. So to start off, the 11-hour rule, it's really simple. You can't drive a commercial motor vehicle for more than 11 hours. And before you have, you're required to take a 10-hour break. 10 consecutive hours off duty or 8 hours in the sleeper berth plus 2 hours in the passenger seat immediately before or after 8 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth or off duty. So that rule is not going to change. That one will stay where it's at. 11 hours of driving, you're done until you have 10 consecutive hours off. Mandatory 30-minute break will change. We'll discuss that change, but let's look at what we have today. May drive only if 8 hours or less have passed since the end of the driver's last off-duty or sleeper berth period of at least 30 minutes. Mandatory in attendance time for hazardous materials may be included in the break if no other duties are performed. And like I said, this regulation will change, so we'll come back and address this one in just a little bit. All right, the next the rule we'll take a look at is the 14-hour rule. And the 14-hour rule is pretty simple too. Once you start your tour of duty, once you're on duty for 14 hours, you no longer can drive without taking a 10-hour consecutive break. The old trick question is, how many hours on duty can you be in a 24-hour period? And the answer is 24 hours. You just can no longer drive after being on duty 14 hours. You can go ahead and work in the warehouse or unload your truck, fuel it, anything like that. You just cannot drive a commercial motor vehicle. And then we have the accumulative hour rule, 60 hours in 7 days and 70 hours in 8 days if operating every day of the week. And that's on duty hours. So I get the question all the time, how do I know which one I'm supposed to use? That the FMCSA leaves that choice up to you. Typically, if you're a 5-day week operation, you're going to use the 60 hours in 7 days. If you're a 7-day-a-week operation, you're going to use the 70 hours in 8 days. If you do the math, it really doesn't matter which one you use. So we move on to the 34-hour restart provision. That regulation also will not change. It stays the same. What that says, this addresses the cumulative hours, and once you've had 34 hours of consecutive off-duty time, that restarts your total hours of 60 and 70, goes all the way back down to 0. So applies even if you're starting with an over hours 60 to 70 hour violation. Driver may spend part of his or her 34-hour restart in a sleeper berth as long as the off-duty time is consecutive and not broken by on-duty time or driving time. And there's no restriction to the frequency of use. For you that have been in the business or driving for a while, you know that years, I don't know, it wasn't that long ago, 7, 8 years ago, there was actually a restriction on how many times you could use that. That has been lifted. And so there is no restriction on how many times you can use a 34-hour restart. We're going to take a look at the 14-hour rule exception, 100 air mile radius exception, 150 air mile radius for non-CDL, driver salesperson, and then the adverse driving conditions. And all of these exceptions you should be training your drivers on, especially now with these changes that are going to happen next Tuesday. Drivers need to be aware of what those changes are going to be and how they're going to impact them as a driver. So the 14-hour exception. This sounds complicated, and it's really not. It's if you just take it piece by piece, it's okay. A lot of carriers use it. Keep in mind that all these exceptions, it's up to you, the motor carrier, whether you want your drivers to use these. You as the motor carrier can determine, hey, it's our company policy, we don't use any of these exceptions. That's perfectly fine. These are exceptions to hours of service regulations the FMCSA has put out there to allow you, the motor carrier, to operate and maybe more flexible. But that is still your decision whether or not your drivers use these exceptions. So the first one, 14 hours. Basically, what it says is that the driver may extend their 14-hour on-duty period by 2 hours if they are released from duty for the previous 5 duty tours and return the work reporting location released from duty within 16 hours, and you have not used this exception in the previous 7 days, except following a 34-hour restart of the 7-8-day period. Total driving hours, even though you're extending that 14-hour rule by 2 on-duty hours by 2 hours, getting you out to 16 hours of on-duty, your driving time cannot exceed 11 hours. The 100 air mile radius exception. This one will change next Tuesday. We'll talk about the change here in just a second, but here's where it is today. This exempts drivers from 395.8 grid logbook requirements if the driver operates exclusively within 100 air mile radius of the reporting location, returns to the reporting location within 12 consecutive hours, does not exceed 11 hours of driving time following 10 hours off duty. Motor carrier retains time records for the driver, so the driver has to fill out a time record. What is a time record? It documents the time the driver started the tour, the time they ended the tour, and the total hours. So that's a time record. I always get the question, does my time card, my driver's time cards meet the requirement of a time record? Well, if it has those 3 things on that, then it meets the requirement. Typically, time cards don't have total hours for the day. Some do, but if it has those 3 items on it, it meets the requirements of a time record. And so 100 air mile radius, what does that mean on the ground? Christopher Columbus taught us that the ground's not flat, so air miles and ground miles are not the same. So 100 air mile radius is 115.2. So you put a flagpole in the center of your terminal, go out to the edge of the circle, 115.2 ground miles, make a circle. They can operate inside that circle. Couple things with this exception that you need to understand. 1, 30-minute break, not required. It's not required. That we discussed earlier, a 30-minute break is not required for 100 air mile radius exception. Can you cross state lines with a 100 air mile radius exception? And the answer is yes. This is an interstate regulation. Interstate regulations are made for interstate carriers who cross state lines. So yes, you can cross state lines as long as it's within that 100 air mile radius, okay? Then the other thing is that what happens if the driver can't meet the requirements of this exception? Say in the morning they're dispatched. The intention of the dispatcher is to make sure they're back within 12 consecutive hours and they don't go outside that radius. As soon as the driver has knowledge that they cannot meet the requirements of the exception, they have to immediately stop in a safe place, and they have to reconstruct a logbook from the start of the tour of duty, okay? Because at that point, they're no longer exempted from the grid log or logbook hours of service regulation, okay, of filling out a grid logbook. Non-CDL, there's a little bit different spin on non-CDL. They can go out 150 air miles, which is 172.5 ground miles. They can drive 11 hours max. Same with the 100 air mile radius, 11 hours max. 2 days a week, they can go up to the 16th hour after coming on duty. The other 5 days must comply with the 14-hour rule. not required to keep logbooks, not eligible, obviously, for the 100 air mile provision or current 16-hour exception. So that's non-CDO. And then we have the driver salesperson exception. Employee of a private carrier engaged in selling and delivering goods operates solely within 100-mile radius, devotes not more than 50% of on-duty time to driving. What's the exception? It's on their cumulative hours of 60 and 70 and 70 and 8. Driving time must not exceed 40 hours and 7 days. So you do the math there. They can go 50% of on-duty time to driving. They can go up to 80 hours of on-duty in a 7-day period. Now, with the changes that we're going to talk about here in just a little bit, the National Private Truck Council, or NPTC, has filed a petition with the FMCSA to include the driver salespersons in the 150 air mile radius exception. Okay, so back up to the definition. Employee of a private carrier engaged in selling and delivering their own goods. And I've got involved with enforcement officers on this definition. So you cannot have your goods pre-sold. It's not where the truck rolls up and delivers something. It's where the driver is actually the salesperson. They walk into the store or a business and they determine what they need at that point, go out back to the truck and get what they need, and then put it in the store for sale. That can range from bread to ice cream to there's shoe salesmen like that, right? That do work shoes and those type of things. That would be a driver salesperson. They have no idea what they're going to sell when they roll up to the business. Okay. All right. And now the last one is that conditions exception. And this has been around for a long time. If you haven't trained your drivers on this, I would. This is going to change next Tuesday as well. So just hang on here and train them as the new regulation. But if a driver encounters adverse driving conditions that could not be anticipated prior to the start of the trip or tour of duty, the 11-hour driving rule can be extended by 2 hours. This exception does not pertain to the 14-hour rule. So you'll see when we talk about the new change to this regulation, that'll help you out with the 14-hour rule. So with that exception, again, train drivers, make sure they understand that this can't be used if you're going through a high congested traffic area. It's that way all the time at rush hour. I'm going to use a 2-hour adverse driving condition. No, doesn't apply. Okay. Weather conditions could apply as long as you don't anticipate that would occur. The best way to do this is to document the condition. If there's any way, if it's an accident and you can get online, screenshot something, so you got that documentation. To be honest, if an enforcement officer goes through your hours of service and your driver occasionally uses this, and by occasionally, I mean maybe once a month, maybe once every 2-3 months, you're going to be fine. But if they're finding your drivers using this every week, you're going to have a problem. Okay? Especially if it's not documented. Okay, one last thing that I'd like to address here. This is not an FMCSA regulation. This is just good business and protecting your liability. In the regulations, it says that if a driver has another part-time job, that they are supposed to let you, the motor carrier, know and report those hours to you. So what does that mean specifically, right? So if we go to CFR 395.2 and we take a look at the definition of on-duty time, it starts out as driving, of course, loading, unloading, fueling, all those kind of things. And we get down to number 8 and number 9, and performing any other work in the capacity employer service of a motor carrier. Any other work. And that doesn't say compensated, any other work in the capacity, employ, or service of a motor carrier is on duty time. Okay. Performing any compensated work for a person, number 9, who is not a motor carrier. And this is the one that you got to be careful, especially, we saw this during the recession when times were tough and maybe you reduced hours for some of your drivers and they went out and got jobs somewhere else. All that time has to be recorded. Okay. So years ago, I put together a form that you can use as a motor carrier when you're hiring new drivers. I would recommend you use this, and I would even update this annually if I was a safety director, and that's driver certification for other compensated work. So basically, the driver is telling you that they are yes or no, are they currently working for another employer? And at this time, do you intend to work for another employer while still employed by this company? Yes or no? And then I hereby certify that the information given above is true. And I understand that once I become employed with this company, if I work for an additional employer or employers for compensation, I must inform this company immediately of any such employment activity. So what is this all about? Well, where this raises its ugly head is if your driver's involved in an accident and all of a sudden the hours of service are starting to be looked at as, was the driver in compliance with the hours of service regulations at the time of the accident? These plaintiffs' attorneys are really good and they're going to start digging, okay? You thought your driver, say the accident occurred Monday morning, you thought your driver had been off all weekend, so you took the 34-hour, the driver took the 34-hour restart for the cumulative hours, and lo and behold, your driver had a part-time job selling Christmas trees during Christmas over the weekend and was paid to sell Christmas trees. That's all on duty time that whole time that they were there. And so if that's what occurred, the 34-hour restart goes away because he or she didn't have 34 hours consecutive off-duty time. That's gone. And so the 60, 70 cumulative hours is still there. In addition, that on-duty time's added into the cumulative hours, and then you end up with what you got for Monday, and there's a good chance that they weren't in compliance with the hours of service at the time of the accident. So that's just something I would recommend. If you're not using that type of form now, I would recommend you do that. So let's take a look now at the changes that are going to go into effect next Tuesday. And by the way, the FMCSA has to get very exact with this because we have drivers operating 24 hours a day, right? And so the change will actually go into effect at 12:01 a.m. on September 29th. So that's right after midnight on September 28th. That's when the new hours of service rules go into effect. There's 4 different rules that will change. These changes will provide additional flexibility for your driver and for you, the motor carrier. So let's take a look at the changes. Okay, the first exemption we'll take a look at is the short haul exemption change. With this change, we're now going to combine CDL and non-CDL together. So the 100 and the 150 that was previous is all together in one short haul exemption. And it'll allow both those, CDL or non-CDL, to operate within 150 air mile radius or 172.5 ground miles. However, they must return to the work reporting location within 14 hours. And this will allow them to be exempt from driver logs, electronic logging devices, and the 30-minute rest break requirements. There's one caveat back there, and I'll talk about it here a little bit when we talk about exceptions for electronic logging devices. I'll get into that. But typically, it's going to exempt them from the grid logs, ELD, and the 30-minute rest break. So if you're using this exemption, a time record is required. Remember, we talked about that. 3 things required on a time record: time started, time ended, total hours, and time for the last 7 days. So the time records must be kept for 6 months. You're not required, under this exemption, required to carry any document in the truck showing the driver is using the short haul exemption. However, you need to train your drivers if they're using this exception, because the enforcement officers will start a series of questions immediately. What time did you start today? Where is your terminal location? What time do you intend to be back there today? Where else are you going to be delivering today? All those questions can come up to see if you comply to this hours of service exemption. As I discussed earlier with the short haul exemption, if you exceed the 100 air mile radius, or you cannot return to your work reporting location in 14 hours, the driver must immediately construct a paper log for the beginning of that day. All the way from the start of duty forward, they have to reconstruct what they did, document that on the log document. The driver may use paper logs in this manner if they cannot meet the exemption requirements for up to 8 days in any rolling 30-day period. If you exceed 8 days in a rolling 30-day period, you will then be required to use an electronic logging device. If you cannot return to your work reporting location in 14 hours, now you're 14 hours on duty in a day. The driver must not drive a commercial motor vehicle without 10 hours of consecutive off duty. That's the 14-hour rule kicks in. Carriers and drivers may use ELDs voluntarily, even if the driver is subject to short haul exemption. There again, this is an exemption. It's the motor carrier's discretion whether or not their drivers use this exemption. Adverse driving conditions. So as we discussed, where this exemption is today, it only extends 11-hour rule. Now, the new rule amends the adverse driving conditions exceptions to allow a driver an extra 2 hours in which to operate when encountering adverse driving conditions, but it also extends that 14-hour rule by 2 hours. So that's the good thing with this exemption change, is that it extends the 14 hours as well as the 11, whereas the previous regulation only extended the 11. Okay, all the rest of the stuff is in place. As far as the adverse driving conditions mean snow, ice, sleet, fog, or an adverse weather condition or unusual road or traffic condition that were not known or could not reasonably known to a driver immediately prior to the beginning of the duty day or immediately before beginning driving after a qualifying rest break or or a motor carrier immediately prior to dispatching the driver. So they can't anticipate that this would occur and then go ahead and use the exception. Okay. You should annotate their ELD entry if you're using the ELD as far as the adverse driving condition needs to be indicated that on your ELD that that's what you elected to do. Again, motor carriers may decline to allow drivers to use this adverse driving condition exception as a matter of company policy. The next change to the hours of service rules addresses the 30-minute break change, and I'm sure this one's going to be welcomed by your drivers. So the old rule said that once you were on duty for 8 hours, that you had to take a 30-minute break on duty. So the rule change is that the break is not required until the driver has 8 hours of cumulative driving, not 8 hours of on duty. You cannot break up the 30-minute rest period or break period. You know, you can't do 10 minutes here and 20 minutes there. It has to be consecutive. As a driver, you may operate an on-duty yard move of a vehicle during the 30-minute break time if you're using the short haul exception and exceed the 150 air mile radius during a duty period, or you can't get back within 14 hours, then you're going to have to take the 30-minute break as required. Okay. The next one is the split sleeper berth. This provision allows the driver to split 10 hours off duty period if the one period, whether or not in the sleeper berth, is at least 2 hours long, and the other involves at least 7 hours in the sleeper berth when using together. Neither's period counts against your 14-hour driving window that you have. So before it was 8 and 2, this can go to 3 to 7. So when do these changes go into effect? As I said, next Tuesday at 12:01 a.m. Next Tuesday, September 29th, the changes will go into effect. So now we'll discuss electronic logging devices, or ELDs. This regulation's been in effect for over 3 years now, so everyone, I think, is pretty comfortable with operating with ELDs. I think this has done well for our industry as a whole. It's leveled the playing field between carriers. It's obviously brought a lot of carriers into compliance with hours of service that wasn't there before. So one interesting fact here on electronic logging devices. The NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, back in 1990, each year they issue their top 10 wish list. And the NTSB, as everybody probably understands, they do investigation of major crashes, not only of trucks, but airplanes, trains, those kind of things. And so they had issued their top 10 wish list. That's 30 years ago. In that top 10 was a request to the FMCSA that a regulation be made that all commercial motor vehicles have onboard electronic recording devices. So it's 30 years ago. And it took the FMCSA, until 3 years ago to get that all figured out. But it's been a long time coming, but we're here. So electronic logging devices, what we're going to talk about, is for interstate carriers only, those carriers that have to comply to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. So in the past 3 years, we've seen the states either adopt the regulation of electronic logging devices for intrastate, or have not adopted that, or have made a change to the adoption, whatever. Okay, so there again, if you want to know where your state sits with ELD at the end of this webinar, shoot me an email, and I'll be glad to let you know where they sit on adopting the Interstate electronic logging device regulation. So the ELD requirements today, the manufacturer of the device you are using must be registered with the FMCSA as a compliant device. And that is a self-registration process. There's nothing that the FMCSA does as an approval process. They can, I suppose, if someone is registered saying they're compliant and they're not, they can take some action, but that's a self-registration process. The device must be fixed to the unit. So for one, it needs to be hooked into the engine control module, the ECM. The display panel, what's inside the cab of the truck, has to be fixed to the unit. So what does, by definition, what does fixed mean? That means that you cannot have if you're using a smart device for your hours of service and it's connected Bluetooth to your telematics, that's hardwired into the ECM, that's fine, but your smart device cannot be laying on a seat or in your pocket. It has to be fixed to the unit. Could that be Velcro? The answer is yes. Could that be a ram mount or a mount of some sort? Sure. It just needs to be fixed to the unit, okay? The device must be able to print or display in the commercial motor vehicle. Print or display does not mean both, has to do one or the other. The regulation applies to all commercial motor vehicles required by hours of service greater than 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating, the same compliance that we talked about in the very first slide of this presentation. Must be connected to the engine ECM, as I said, and must be able to transfer information to law enforcement officials upon request. So has to be able. So right away you see from this first slide, there's a lot of training that needs to go on with the driver. Drivers need to understand how these work. Do not put a driver into a unit with electronic logging device when they don't understand how it works. If they get pulled over, go through scale, they need to be able to provide all of the information we just talked about here in this slide to a law enforcement official, and they need to understand how it works. So let's discuss the exceptions to the ELD. So the first exception is for a driver who occasionally drives, or a driver that's utilizing the short haul exemption and does not paper log more than 8 days during any rolling 30-day period. They are exempt from ELDs. So if you've got somebody that just occasionally drives once, twice a month, 3 times a month, that's fine. They can paper log. They don't need an ELD. If they paper log more than 8 days during any rolling 30-day period, then they're required to have an ELD. So drivers who conduct drive-away tow-away operations where the vehicle is the product being delivered are not required to have an ELD. Drive-away tow-away operations mean any operation in which any motor vehicle, trailer, semi-trailer, singly or in combination, new or used, constitutes a commodity being transported when one or more of the wheels of any such vehicle on the roadway during the course of transportation, whether or not any such vehicle furnishes the motive power. So it's basically saying it could be pulled, it could be driven, as long as it's the product that's being delivered. Drivers of vehicles manufactured before model year 2000. This is because the engine control module does not have the technology needed to provide the ELD to let it operate, basically. So they're exempt. And then there is an exception for rentals, 8 days or less. So this is something obviously Idealease was very involved in with the Truck Renting and Leasing Association, TRALA, and the FMCSA to try to get us an exemption. We had a 30-day exemption early on back in October 2017. And then the FMCSA reverted back to the 8 days, no different than the short haul, the rolling 30-day period exemption. You can't log more than 8 days in a rolling 30-day period. So if you rent a truck that's subject and the driver's subject to the electronic logging device, you could rent that truck for 8 days or less and could paper log. Okay. As part of this exemption, the driver is required to have a copy of the FMCSA exemption letter with them to provide to an officer. All of our locations have that exemption letter that we provide on short-term rentals like that. The only other requirement with this is if you're involved in a DOT recordable accident during the rental, you need to inform the DOT at that email address right there. So, and then there's one final exemption, and this is for agriculture, that motor carriers carrying fresh produce and other agricultural commodities have been given an exemption to the ELD regulation when operating within 150 air mile radius from the source of the commodities. So there is the exceptions to the electronic logging device. So now we'll discuss ELD user documentation, what a driver must have on board when operating with a ELD. So first and foremost, they have to have a user's manual for operating the ELD, an instruction sheet with step-by-step instructions for transferring hours of service records to an authorized safety official, an instruction sheet on reporting ELD malfunctions and record-keeping procedures during ELD malfunction. And finally, believe it or not, they still have to have a supply of blank paper grid log graphs, specifically at least 8 days in their possession. And that is in case that ELD would malfunction. They now have paper that they can use to record their hours of service. So those are the required documents that the driver has to have in the unit. And there again, that should be all part of your training program with the driver for ELD. So now we're going to discuss supporting documents required for hours of service. Myself, as well as a lot of people in the industry, thought that with the adoption of the ELD, that as a motor carrier, there would be a reduction in the number and types of supporting documents that as a motor carrier you would have to keep. However, that didn't happen, and actually there's an increase. So the final rule requires fleets to retain up to 8 supporting documents from several categories per driver per 24-hour period. So bill of ladings, itinerary schedules, or equivalent documents indicating the origin and destination of the trip. That was previously there. Dispatch records, trip records, or equivalent documents. Those were all basically there. Expense receipts related to on-duty, not driving time. But here's the new one. Text messages, email messages, instant messages, or other electronic mobile communications transmitted through a fleet management system. Payroll records, settlement sheets, or other documents, that was always there before, reflecting driver payments. So that's the supporting documents. And then one final thing that this ELD regulation did was address driver harassment. In fact, back 3 or 4 years before final rule, we got really close to going into final rule, and it was all shut down because the harassment, it didn't address harassment of the driver. So the final rule includes several provisions to guard against harassment of drivers. Specifically, the rule prohibits motor carriers from using information from ELDs to pressure drivers violating regulations. The final rule also requires ELDs to either automatically mute or allow a driver to turn off or mute the volume of an ELD or any fleet management system with integrated ELD functionality when they have logged into the sleeper burst status in the ELD. So the next slide here, I've provided you with the FMCSA's website to frequently asked questions surrounding ELD regulation, and feel free to take a look at that. There's information there that you can use and further enhance your knowledge of the ELD. We'll go over ELD enforcement here. The Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance says commercial motor vehicle drivers are expected to have a registered electronic logging device. It was one of the first things we talked about. To have a qualifying, it has to be registered. If a property carrying driver is operating a CMV without an ELD, they will be placed out of service for 10 hours. If you can't meet one of the exceptions that we discussed for the ELD, they'll be placed out of service for 10 hours. Passenger carrying operation is 8 hours. You'll be placed out of service. In addition, failing to have an E-log device will appear on the roadside inspection report, and a ticket or civil penalty may be given to the driver and counted against their CSA hours of service basic. The CVSA indicates that after being placed out of service for 8 to 10 hours respectively, the driver may continue to their final destination, but he or she must accurately document his or her hours of service using a paper record of duty status and carry a copy of the inspection report and or citation. If stopped again before reaching the final destination, must provide enforcement personnel with a copy of the inspection report and proof that he or she is continuing on the original trip. This may satisfy using a bill of lading. After reaching their final destination, they may return to their principal place of business or terminal empty to obtain an ELD. So if you get caught without an ELD and you're supposed to have one, they're going to let you continue out that trip after 10 consecutive hours off, and then you've got to return to your terminal or principal place of business to get an ELD. If you do that, you've got to go empty, or otherwise you have to have an ELD installed right there. We'll talk about best practices here. And I discussed this on the way along and in the webinar today. Training is so important for new drivers and existing drivers on ELD regulations and the operation of your specific ELD system. Just because you hired a driver from another company and they had an ELD doesn't mean they know how to run your ELD. There are hundreds of ELD systems, probably thousands of them out there. Use ELD violations as a coaching event. However, right behind that, you have to have a progressive disciplinary policy for ELD and hours of service violation. If you put the ELD in and you just let the driver run rampant and have violations, it's no different than the paper violations. Those are all going to catch up to you, and especially on the liability side, all the ELD information is discoverable. Talk to your drivers about their responsibility to inform you, the motor carrier, of other on-duty activity. As we discussed that form, I would recommend that you use that.
Now that we have concluded the webinar, I would ask that if you have any questions about the material we covered today, that you please email me. Our next webinar in the series will be on October 7th, and we will address how the drug and alcohol testing regulations apply to you, a motor carrier. I will leave up my contact information for you to email questions that you may have. The registration link will also be there for you to register for a future webinar. Thanks again for attending the webinar today. Stay safe and take care.